Thank you, Pete. And I also want to extend a thank you to Tanya for inviting me here and for hosting such an excellent event. Thank you all for actually waking up and coming here early in the morning. It's impressive. I struggle with that myself. As Pete said, I am the head of research at Coinshares. We are Europe's largest digital asset manager. We offer a wide range of crypto investment products, including tracker products for Bitcoin and Ether, as well as private strategies. Coinshares Research is our internal research desk. We focus mainly on educational research on our underlying assets, Bitcoin and Ether. We also do some econometric research on 4 of the largest crypto assets out there. Finally, we release a biannual mining report tracking some trends in the Bitcoin mining industry, and that's what I'm here to present on. So it's kind of a lot to cover in a short amount of time, so bear with me. Hopefully I'll be able to get through everything. We'll talk a little bit about some costs of mining, and we'll finally cover a little bit of the energy mix of Bitcoin mining, which is a controversial topic and something that's been sort of victim of a lot of not so good research. So I also want to point out that this presentation is about Bitcoin mining only. It doesn't take into account any other crypto assets of any kind. So we'll start with going over a little bit of terminology. There's a bit of mixed use of terms in the industry when it relates to the creation cost of mined coins. So just going to cover some of the terms that I'm going to use. So obviously reality is a little more complex than this simplified graph that I made here. But we're essentially going to be talking about 2 important points, one of which is your cash flow break-even, below which miners will shut off their gear if the price does not get to levels where it makes any sense to keep the mining gear on when you're essentially bleeding cash. In between that, you have the sort of purgatory area where you are cash flow positive, but you're not going to recover your capex, and you're going to end up with a negative ROI over time. Finally, if the Bitcoin price is above your ROI break-even point, you're going to make a profit, you'll be able to reinvest, and you'll be able to remain in the industry. So part of the reason it's important to keep this in mind is that we see a lot of instances where miners are claiming that their creation cost is quite low, and what they're actually talking about in a bunch of instances is their cash flow break-even point. But because you obviously have to buy gear, and the gear has a finite lifetime, it either gets obsolete over time or it deteriorates to a point where you can't use it anymore. You need to actually make back what you've spent on gear, or you're just going to be eliminated from the market over time. So some of the things that we cover in the paper are trends from the network. So ASICs, kind of like electronics, have the characteristic that it gets cheaper all the time and it gets better all the time. So what you can see here in the leftmost panel is that we've tracked the hardware efficiency of mining gear since the advent of industrial Bitcoin mining in the beginning of 2014 until late. And what you see is that if you plot an exponential trend, you'll notice that all of these graphs are on log scales. You can plot an exponential trend that shows that hardware efficiency versus the first date of shipping is actually increasing by almost 80% year over year for the last 5 years. So at the same time, the hardware cost versus shipping date is falling by over 50% every year. And the difference between the black and the red points is essentially that the red points are all the points that were added after the publication of our first mining paper, and it has its own trend line just to show the change in trend, if any. So you'll see that the hardware efficiency is growing pretty much exactly in line with its previous trend over the last 5 years, whereas the hardware cost versus shipping date is actually showing an increase in the cost cutoff. So when you take the combination of 80% increased hardware efficiency year over year with the halving in cost for hardware year over year, and you add the Bitcoin price to this, you get the annual increase in hash rate trend, which is actually over 300% compound every year since 2014, which is quite substantial. So in our report, we calculate market average ROI break-even levels. And I'm going to discuss a little bit how we actually arrive at these figures. So first of all, we use a bottoms-up approach when trying to calculate this. A lot of mining research out there will essentially look at the compound hash rate. They'll pick a model mining unit, and then they'll model the entire network as if it was made up of that unit in itself, which is a decent way of doing it, but we feel that it misses out on some of the nuances and some of the complexity that's in there. So we actually do it a different way. We have analysts that trawl every forum, every news article in multiple languages, including Chinese and Russian, and we try to actually estimate the total deployment of each mining unit that is relevant at any given time, and then we construct the entire network from individual units instead of the other way around. So what you see in this table is market average ROI break-even levels plotted against electricity cost on the left-hand side and CapEx depreciation schedule on the top. So the CapEx depreciation schedule here is essentially equivalent to the length of which you can run your hardware before it becomes obsolete. So, for example, if you bought S9s when they first came out years ago and you're still running them, you hit the technology curve at a very advantageous point. You can depreciate your hardware over a much longer time, which means that you're going to have a lower ROI break-even. If you bought an S9 last month, you're probably not going to be able to run it for many years going forward, and you're going to have a much harder time breaking even on your ROI. So what you essentially see here is that the players that are making positive ROI these days are the players that have both cheap electricity and hit the technology curve at a good point. So it's important to notice if we go back to this slide right here, is that if you fall below the ROI break-even levels, it doesn't mean that you're going to switch your gear off. That's your cash flow break-even levels. And I'm going to show you a table of our market-wide approximated cash flow break-even levels too in a minute. So right now, under the current prices and the current difficulty, many miners are probably struggling to make a positive ROI, but they're all if you're running your gear at all, you're cash flow positive, so they're all probably cash flow positive. So here we've essentially plotted the sensitivity of your ROI break-even to electricity cost and CapEx. So the graph on the left-hand side here is essentially the table on the previous slide. So each of those lines represent different electricity cost levels, and as you can see, there are only a couple instances these days where you're going to be making a positive ROI. And it also shows how sensitive your ROI is to your electricity cost. And on the right side, it shows how sensitive your ROI is to your actual capital expenditure. If you've paid less than half of the market average price of mining gear, you might be in a pretty good position right now. If you've paid more, as many people did, if they hit the price curve at an unfortunate time, when, as we all know, Bitmain is very savvy in how they price their units, and essentially price it as the sum of the estimated future income that you could get from it, which is quite clever. So if you bought at an unfortunate time, it almost doesn't matter how cheap your electricity is. You're possibly never going to make a positive ROI. So one thing that I want to point out is that there are instances out there where people are mining for not purely profit-driven reasons. We hear about instances where people are essentially using mining for laundering, or where they're happy to essentially mine at a little bit of loss to get access to clean coins. So this might skew these results a tiny bit, but nothing too crazy. So here is a table of the cash flow break-even levels. So these are the levels below which the market average miner, according to our estimates, will actually shut their gear off if the price falls below these levels. So what we've plotted it against here is electricity on the left side, and then you have your additional OPEX on top of electricity for pure mining on the top-hand side. So that means all OPEX that relates to cooling, wages, rentals of whatever it is that you need to run your operation. So you can see here that even if you're mining at sort of a middle-of-the-line type of electricity cost around 5 cents per kilowatt hour, you're still cash flow positive at these levels. So these are the levels below which the price dipped in the late fall of last year. These levels were higher at that point because the difficulty and the hash rate was higher then, and this is why we saw a shutdown on the magnitude that we did of upwards towards 40% of the network. So if prices now were to drop, below, say, $3,000, we'd expect new shutdowns to happen and another contraction of the overall hash rate in the market. So while many miners are struggling to make positive ROI, cash flow is still positive, so we don't expect any type of shutdowns at these rates. Only if the price falls further do we expect any more contraction of the overall hash rate. And again, these are market average figures. They don't apply to any specific miners. It is a market-wide type estimate. Each miner has its own local conditions, obviously, so don't read too much into the specifics. Excuse me? Is this updated for today, or last year, or 6 months ago? These figures are actually as of March 1st. So, excuse me? Sorry? Electricity price of 9%. It's not problem. No, I agree. I mean, if you're running at 9 cents, you're below cash flow break even, so you're not going to run your gear. So here are some stats that we've collected about the network in general. So using our bottom-up approach, we estimate that the total amount of ASIC chips that are currently mining Bitcoin is around 544 million. First, I wanted to actually use like a sort of idealized unit for it, but it doesn't even make that much sense because of the different units and the different amount of chips that sit in them. So figured we'd show the amount of chips instead. So right now, the weighted average hash rate per chip is 0.078 terahash per second, which is a small improvement on the most efficient S9 miner. So you can see that the overall market is starting to slowly run ahead of the S9, which somebody very aptly called the AK-47 of ASIC miners the other day, which I thought was quite a cool description. So the total network electricity spend that is spent directly on hashing in the Bitcoin network is now around 4.1 gigawatts, which is quite a substantial amount of energy. And if we include about 20 to 25% on top of that for cooling market-wide, which we think is probably a little bit conservative, but it's easier to defend conservative estimates than the opposite. So we estimate that the total network electricity spend for Bitcoin mining now comes out to about 4.9 gigawatts, which is equivalent to almost 43 terawatt hours per year. So this brings us on to something that I wanted to talk about, which is getting a lot of media attention and has been getting a lot of media attention, which is the total electricity draw of Bitcoin mining in particular. So throughout last year, there were a lot of essentially FUD in the media where you had mainstream media outlets call Bitcoin like an environmental disaster that was going to ruin our climate goals and it's going to boil the oceans, and governments, please step in and make this illegal. So we wanted to actually get to the bottom of this to a much bigger extent than what we've seen. So essentially the argument that was put forward is a bit of a prejudiced one, and it goes kind of something like this. Almost all Bitcoin miners are in China, and China is dirty and backwards, which is ridiculous and not the case. So we wanted to take a little bit of a closer look on the actual, both the total electricity draw, which we found to be much lower than the estimates that were peddled in the media, and we wanted to look a little bit closer on the actual breakdown of the power sources that are powering the Bitcoin network. So a lot of people in the industry have known this for years, that Bitcoin mining is actually predominantly driven by hydro, mainly either distressed hydro or stranded hydro, which has excess capacity. So, a lot of people were saying this, but we couldn't actually find any hard numbers on it, so we had to do it ourselves. So to get some frame of reference of how much electricity is actually drawn, 4.9 gigawatts is it sounds like a lot, but it's only approximately equivalent to the total draw of global gaming consoles if you play them for 4 hours every day on a brand new TV. So 42.9 terawatt hours is approximately equivalent to the annual primary energy consumption of Latvia, a country of 2 million inhabitants, which isn't very large in the global context of almost 8 billion people. So 43 terawatt hours is almost 0.2% of global annual electricity generation, and it is 0.025% of the global annual primary energy supply, which includes all energy sources, not just electricity. So in order to get to the bottom of this, we kind of had to figure out where all the miners were, because if you're going to look at what type of energy is being input into this industry, you have to figure out actually where are the miners and what are the likely energy sources there. So we did a bunch of research, and we've pinpointed the main regions globally of Bitcoin mining. So most mining is probably still done in China. And within China, most mining is done in Sichuan. There are other relevant mining regions in China, but there are also a ton of relevant mining regions outside of China, mainly the Pacific Northwest, upstate New York, Quebec, Scandinavia, Iceland, the Caucasus, and we're seeing pop-ups now in southern Siberia and also in western Russia. So in order to calculate the renewable energy penetration, we essentially divided these miners into 4 major groups. So you have one group that is in Sichuan. You then have the rest of China grouped into one, with the assumption that it's pretty evenly distributed in the rest of China. And then we group we make a third group called Western relevant miners, where also the assumption is that they're fairly equally distributed across those regions. And then there's a rest of the world type category. So we teamed up with some friends of ours from Three Body Capital, and we got some data on the renewables penetration by Chinese province, for example. So as you can see, Sichuan is almost entirely driven by renewables. They have a huge hydro industry with overcapacity on an annual basis. According to Reuters, the total capacity of the Sichuan grid is less than half of the total generation capacity of their hydro dams. In 2017, Sichuan province wasted something on the order of 4 times the total electricity draw of Bitcoin by essentially letting water run over the dams because of lack of demand. So you can see here 3 of our groups that we puzzled together. You have Sichuan, which is a 90% renewables penetration. You then have the rest of China, of which we take an average, assuming that it's all sort of equally distributed. And then we do the same in the relevant Western provinces, where we essentially take an average of the renewables penetration in all the relevant mining regions. So the source for the renewables penetration of Chinese provinces is from Morgan Stanley Research, and for the rest of the Western countries and provinces, it is the Energy Information Administration. So if you then couple this with our estimates for where miners are mainly located, we estimate that 60% of mining is done in China. 80% of that is done in Sichuan, which comes out to around 48% of global mining. The rest of relevant remaining Chinese mining is about 12%. We think that about 35% is done in the relevant Western provinces that we have, and around 5% is done in the rest of the world. So if you multiply all of this with the respective renewables penetrations per region, you find that, and this is a conservative estimate in my opinion, because if we go back to the previous slide, you'll see, for example, that we've listed New York as 45% renewables penetration, but we know, in fact, that most of the electricity there is upstate from hydro, and the same goes for Russia, which has a very low renewables penetration here, but we know that mining is predominantly done around large hydro dams, particularly in southern Siberia. So we actually feel like the number that we've come to here, which is 77.6% renewables penetration share for Bitcoin mining, is actually quite conservative. So as you can see, like, this is quite a far cry from what we've heard in the media of Bitcoin mining is an absolute ecological disaster and it's going to ruin our climate goals. Actually, it's opposite. Bitcoin is more driven by renewables than almost any other large-scale industry on the planet. So we are kind of sick of this narrative, and we're trying hard to flip it on its head. Instead of seeing Bitcoin as a threat to our climate goals, it's actually the other way around. If Bitcoin is already pumping several billions of dollars directly into probably struggling renewables projects, it will increase their profitability immediately. If renewables projects have sort of an electricity buyer of last resort that exists globally, that is able to mobily deploy to basically wherever renewables can be produced for the cheapest, this is actually a net benefit to our development of renewable energy projects. So, quite contrary to Bitcoin's going to destroy our climate goals, I think Bitcoin can do a lot to help our climate goals. There's this misunderstood narrative out there that for each kilowatt hour that Bitcoin takes from the network, it means that somebody else is displaced. It's actually not the case at all. A lot of this hydro that is going into Bitcoin mining wouldn't be used for anything if it weren't for Bitcoin. And in fact, if we can increase the profitability of these projects, there's a higher chance that they see it fit to reinvest in other projects in the region. And if we get to certain levels of scale, it makes economic sense to hook this all up in a more efficient way to the rest of the domestic electricity demand, such that we actually get a net lowering of domestic energy prices, which is something that we want. So this is essentially what I wanted to present to you guys. If you guys want to look at how we did this in detail, I suggested you guys go and download our mining report. You can find it on our website, coinshares.co.uk/research. And if you're interested in these types of metrics and these types of data, please follow me on Twitter. Follow Coinshares on Twitter. We publish things, semi-regularly. Read the research, look into our assumptions. It's not a perfect model by any stretch of the imagination, but we do believe that this is the strongest model that is out there. And if you go in and you disagree with some of the assumptions, you can actually tweak it yourself and see what you come to. With that, I take it to a word from our lawyers. So now that you've all read that, thank you.
Wonderful. Keep it going for Christopher Bendiksen. Yeah, to do question and answer if you have any.
If there's anything.
Sometimes it takes people a second. We'll give you a second. I know that we have at least one question in the room for Christopher. Oh, we have a question right over there.
Oh.
Sorry, just a quick question. Will you be around or are you taking off?
I'll be around. Definitely. Yep.
You mentioned earlier your talk about Bitmain and the fact that they have some very, very clever strategies for charging. When you were doing your analysis of ROI,
Yeah.
did you ever look at the cost of manufacture of these devices, or did you only look at the retail cost of sales? Because Bitmain, there's a lot of speculation that Bitmain underpriced their units towards the end to try and drive competitors out of business. As someone in that industry, I pretty much agree with that assessment, because sometimes they were clearly selling things below cost.
Right.
Did you ever, in your research, try and factor what that might mean? Because 51%, clearly that can't continue.
Yeah, so we essentially have, for Bitmain gear, we have two groups. But to answer it quickly, no, we don't look at manufacturing cost. We look at what we consider to be the weighted average paid retail cost for these units. And for Bitmain, we have two groups. We have, and this is getting less and less relevant, but we have a different group for their self-mining, where they pay a lower cost themselves, obviously, than they charge others. But no, we haven't particularly looked into that. Like, obviously, we look at what people report that they've paid for them. So we look at prices on websites, but then we also trawl the message boards to actually figure out what people have paid in reality, because what you see on a website isn't necessarily what you pay, especially if you have a good relationship and you buy in bulk. So we do take the nuances into account, but maybe not in the way you imagined. Yeah. Yeah.
And mining has the advantage of it's going to slow down some of the shipping containers, slow down some of the mining throughout the day. So would that reinforce your argument of you can, when there's a lot of excess power, that's when the Bitcoin is maximizing its mining. And when the price of power goes up, less the underlying demand is greater. And you can mine less during the day. That sort of reinforces one of your themes that goes into that.
Well, I think what you're describing is more likely to be the case in the future. Right now, mining is such an arms race that if you're not running your gear pretty much 24/7, you run the risk of it being obsoleted by the difficulty increase before you can make a positive ROI. If we get to the point where mining hardware development slows down, which we should hit at some point as we hit, the laws of physics determining, the width of circuits on a chip. This could be more of the case in the future, or if you end up with instances where you can buy, for example, obsolete, nearly free mining hardware that you put near generation capacity that has the propensity to have these types of like excess production cycles, and there, yes, you can sort of peak shave with it. So I don't think that's something that is hugely happening right now, but I think that is something that could be very useful in the future. That being said, you have annual changes in production. So, for example, in southwestern China, the hydro production is very dependent on the rainy season. So you essentially have 3 seasons in Sichuan with 3 different energy prices. And we're actually seeing quite a lot of Chinese miners in particular being quite mobile, sort of being like mining nomads. They take their gear and they ship it around inside of China to different regions depending on where the electricity is cheapest those months. So.
Yeah, I'm just intrigued. Not just supply wrapping up down.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. Yeah, one last.
Thank you. Have you done similar research on GPU mining?
No, sorry. Don't have the capacity. I would love to, but it's a bear market. It's hard to get enough analysts to the research desk. Thank you all.
You guys give a nice round of